There's one that's called a heading cut, and that's when we take a branch and we cut it part way back. Right?
Heading cut.
Yep. What that does is it encourages all these nodes to grow. There's a thing called apical dominance in a lot of plants, and particularly in almost all species of fruit trees, where the bud at the tip of a branch, and even more so at the tip of the central leader, but the bud at the tip of the branch makes these hormones called auxins that stop all these buds from growing. Right? That's why the tip grows out, and all these just make leaves that make sugars and feed the tree, but they don't grow. So when we cut the tip off, when we make that heading cut, what happens is the next 4 buds are empowered, shall we say, to anthropomorphize things, are empowered to grow because there's nothing making that auxin hormone.
I think we're basically
by doing that, we manage to get a tree that's branching off. This is really important to get trees that are branching off.
How are you imagining it just like...
on fruit trees, we never want more than about 18 inches between branching. Because most of them tend to bear out towards the tips of new-ish growth a lot of the time. So if you have these long, whippy growths, and the fruit bears out towards the tips, you get that. Right. And then you get branches breaking. No good. So that's a heading cut. When we cut it back, it also encourages the branch to get thicker, which is also really, really valuable given that we're looking to hang, in the case of some of these trees, 60, 70 pounds of fruit on that tree. Some of these branches are going to have 5, 6 pounds of fruit on them. We want them to be good and sturdy. The other type of cut is a thinning cut, right? Which is taking a branch out altogether. We do that to try to prevent overcrowding. This, if we actually had this, we're going to cut this off down here. But if we actually had like this on, say, on a horizontal branch, like this is way too crowded. These would be just competing like crazy with each other. And fruit needs good sun in order to ripen up well and evenly. So like if this were on a horizontal branch, if this were on a horizontal branch, we would literally take off easily the majority of these branches. We'd do something.
Did they worry about getting too close to the main?
You actually want to cut close to it. When you make thinning cuts, if you come look closely, here, let's look at this bud. See, we've got the trunk here, and we've got the branch here. And we've got this thing in between, this weird little bump. It's called the bud collar. And that's actually the only place on the tree that makes the proper chemicals to heal over. Right? So nowhere else on it can it heal over. So when you make the cut, you actually want to go with your blade on the inside, closest to it, because the anvil can crush. And you make that cut, and you want it right on that bud collar line. And that way the cut can actually heal over, and that'll prevent disease.
And you said called that bud collar.
The bud collar.
Interesting.
Yes.
Okay. Interesting.
Aptly named, I would say.
I would say that is aptly
Are
named.
these the same thing? Just
Not quite. They actually don't heal over all the way, but that's okay. We cut them when they're small, and it's all right.
Okay.
So the other thing I forgot to mention about
make a head cut.
these heading cuts,
Yeah.
you want to cut close to the bud. Well, let's talk about the bud we pick actually first. The last bud that you leave is going to become the dominant growing branch again. After about 6 weeks, it's going to start making that auxin hormone that we were talking about that suppresses growth in all the others. So at first, the top 3 or 4 or 5 will grow evenly. But eventually, the one on the outside will become dominant again and will grow the most. So when you pick that outside bud that you cut to, you always want to pick a bud that's growing the direction that you want your main branch to be. In the case of a tree this young, and really for the next 5 to 6 years on this tree, you're pretty much always going to pick a bud that points out.
And what are you calling a bud?
All of these,
Like a node, these
this,
nodes?
this, well, these are actually buds.
Okay, these are buds.
Yep.
Like right there's a bud, like this little
Yep.
growth. Okay.
Each of these little
Just-
things is
just-
a bud. A node, where's a good example of a node? That's a node. There would have been a bud there years
Okay.
ago.
Okay.
I mean, I suppose the buds are on nodes as well.
Okay, I just,
Um,
I'm just trying to.
But yeah, all of these are all buds.
Okay.
So the actual cut we're going to make on this tree is far less exciting, or far more exciting, depending on who you ask.
Right.
More dramatic.
It is more dramatic.
It is certainly more dramatic.
Certain angle, is it a 45?
Yep. You know, the
Just
exact
slanted.
angle of it is up for debate.
Right,
Right.
The important thing is you want water to run away from the bud you leave at the end.
right.
Um, And a lot of times, actually, when you get up into, you know, with this initial cut, that is also relative to the ground. But you run into folks who are like, oh, you're supposed to cut at a 45-degree angle. Let's put it that way, actually. You're supposed to cut at a 45-degree angle from the bud. And, you know, they make a cut like that.
Right.
And the branch is like that. And it's like perfectly level for water to pool. Right? Less important that it's angled according to the bud. And more important that water just runs away from that last bud.
Now, what did you say about, you were talking about the buds and then you were saying you're supposed to cut down, we're supposed to trim down, you said to like the fourth bud, is that what you said? Well, when we're trimming the branches later,
Well, later we want to leave we want 14 to 18 inches.
okay,
And we always want to pick a bud that's pointing outwards.
okay, it's the
As
bud
our
that's
last
pointing
bud.
outwards. Okay,
That's what's important
Okay.
there. What I was going to say is that if you want to get really adventurous out here this summer, not that adventurous, on some of these species, the plums, the nectarines, the peach, they're all likely to grow a lot. They're likely to grow 3, 4, 5, 6 feet,
Wow.
okay,
which is hilarious because they'll be huge.
right,
And then when you do your dormant season pruning next year, they'll be 18 inches from where they are now.
oh, okay,
But if you want to avoid that and you want to get an extra year ahead of the game, what you can do is once these get out to 18 inches, right? Once this tree is here this year, you can come out and just pinch off the tips to an outside pointing leaf. And if you just pinch off the tips, well, no, it'll do the same thing as the pruning does, where those 4 nodes below it will start growing, right? And that way you can skip a year, essentially. Because what will happen this year, if you don't do that, what will happen is this node, this node, this node, and this node will be our 4 dominant branches. So 4 or 5 of these top nodes will all push new buds that grow like crazy. And if we don't do that, they're just going to grow what we call whips, which are these straight, long growths with no branching that we talked about, where if they ever bore fruit, they'd bend over and
right,
break.
okay.
So, you know, in example A, in possible future 1, shall we call it, where we don't do any summer pruning, we end up with the tree that's about here next year, and then we come back in the winter, we cut it all the way back down to here.
Okay.
Right. So we start next growing season right about here. Possible future 2, where once we're at 18 inches or so, we come out and pinch back all the way to an outward pointing leaf. Then they branch out again, right? And they do that same thing where four buds or so all push out, right? So we come out to here, and then we fork, and we're out to here, right? So we get to advance by a year.
Is it basically the same from that point on? Is it then from the fork,
We-
pinch back, grow?
We could do it with some of the species, potentially the plums. We could do it a second time in 1 year.
Okay.
I've been playing with it lately. I got apricots now to full maturity in 2 years, where their structure is perfect, they're this big, and they're only 2 years old. It's a pretty nifty little trick. Allows you to skip some time and get a lot more fruit a lot quicker.
Yeah.
Pushes it closer to instant gratification, which is not what trees are good for, but we can try, right? So this is really the basics for pruning this year. Almost everything I'm just going to go around and irrigation. let's look at this stuff.